Welcome back. Tonight, we are going to travel back in time, not to the grand Colosseum, not to the marble temples gleaming in the Italian sun, not to the senators draped in white togas debating philosophy over wine. No, tonight we are going to the real Rome, the messy, loud, dangerous, smelly, exhausting Rome that the history books often leave out. The Rome where ordinary people woke up every single day and just tried to survive. When most people think of ancient Rome, they picture power, they picture empire, they picture Julius Caesar, Augustus, gladiators, legions marching across Europe, aqueducts carrying crystal clear water across mountains. And yes, all of that was real. Rome was genuinely one of the most impressive civilizations in human history. But here is the thing. That grandeur existed at the very top of Roman society. For the millions of ordinary people who lived in Rome's crowded streets, daily life was not grand at all. It was in fact deeply exhausting. So tonight, we are going to go through Roman daily life piece by piece, the housing, the food, the streets, the noise, the social rules, the fires, the diseases, the lack of sleep, and the sheer relentless pressure of just existing in a city of over 1 million people in the ancient world. And as we go, we will compare what life was like then compared to what we have today, so you can truly appreciate just how different and how difficult it all was. So get comfortable, turn down the lights, and let us begin. Let us start with housing, because where you sleep tells you everything about your life. In ancient Rome, the majority of the city's population, historians estimate somewhere between 700,000 and 1.2 million people at the city's peak, lived in buildings called insulae. The word simply means islands in Latin, and these were Rome's version of apartment buildings, except calling them apartment buildings makes them sound far nicer than they actually were. Insulae were typically 4 to 7 stories tall, sometimes even taller, and they were built quickly and cheaply, often using poor quality materials. The ground floors were usually the most desirable. They were closer to street level, easier to escape from in case of fire, and were often used by wealthier tenants or as shops. The higher you lived in an insulae, the poorer you probably were, and the higher floors had almost none of the comforts even the ground floor offered. There was no running water in most of these upper floors. Tenants on the upper floors had to carry water up by hand from public fountains on the street. There was no toilet in your apartment. Instead, you used a chamber pot and then dumped it out of the window, or you walked down all those flights of stairs to use one of the public latrines on the street. There was no central heating, which mattered a great deal during Roman winters in a city built on hills with stone floors and thin walls. People burned small braziers, basically portable fire pits, inside their rooms to keep warm, which created smoke, which created fire hazards, and which made the air inside genuinely dangerous to breathe over long periods. By comparison, if you live in a modern apartment building today, even a relatively humble one, you have running water on demand, a private toilet, central heating, smoke alarms, fire escapes, and building codes that guarantee a minimum standard of safety. The average Roman in an insulae had none of these things, and the rents were still high. Roman landlords were not known for their generosity.
And it got worse. Insulae had a deeply alarming tendency to catch fire and collapse. The construction was often shoddy. Landlords cut corners, used poor materials, built taller than was safe, and skimped on maintenance. The Roman architect Vitruvius, writing in the 1st century BCE, complained bitterly about the poor quality of construction in the city. Owners would build up and up and up, chasing rents without caring whether the structure below could support it. The Great Fire of 64 CE, the one often associated with Emperor Nero, burned for 6 days and destroyed or severely damaged 10 of Rome's 14 districts. But smaller fires happened constantly, almost every year in some neighborhood. The satirist Juvenal, writing in the early 2nd century CE, described the terror of living in an upper-floor apartment. By the time the fire alarm reached you on the 5th or 6th floor, the floors below were already burning. You had almost no time to escape with anything more than your life. Augustus, Rome's first emperor, established the vigiles, a corps of watchmen and firefighters around 6 CE, which was a genuine improvement. But firefighting in the ancient world was nothing like today. There were no hoses, no pressurized water systems, no thermal cameras. Firefighters in Rome fought fires mostly by pulling down buildings around the fire to create a fire break, and by throwing water in buckets. It was, to put it gently, not very effective. Compare that to today, when most modern cities have professional fire departments with response times measured in minutes, fire-resistant building materials, sprinkler systems, and smoke detectors. In ancient Rome, fire was a constant ambient background fear that never entirely went away. Now, let us talk about something that might surprise you: noise. Ancient Rome was extraordinarily, almost unimaginably loud, and the Romans themselves knew it. Julius Caesar, during his time in Rome, issued one of history's earliest anti-traffic ordinances. He banned wheeled vehicles from the streets of Rome during daylight hours, specifically to reduce congestion and noise. Cart drivers, merchants, and delivery workers were only allowed into the city at night, which sounds helpful until you realize what that meant for the people trying to sleep. All the carts, all the wagons, all the deliveries, they happened at night. The grinding of iron wheels on stone-paved streets, the shouting of cart drivers, the braying of donkeys and the lowing of oxen, the clattering and banging of goods being unloaded outside shops. The Roman satirist Juvenal, who complained about a great many things, honestly, wrote in his third satire that sleep in Rome was nearly impossible. He described the city as a place where the sick died of insomnia before they ever died of their illness. And it was not just the carts. Rome during the day was packed. The forums were crowded with merchants, lawyers, politicians, beggars, slaves, soldiers, and tourists. Street vendors shouted their prices. Schools, which often had no walls and operated in open colonnades or even just on the street, meant that teachers were literally yelling their lessons at students in public. Blacksmiths hammered iron, bakers ran their mills. Construction was essentially constant as the city endlessly expanded and rebuilt. There was no concept of a quiet zone. There was no noise ordinance beyond Caesar's cart ban. There were no double-paned windows to muffle the sound. The walls of insulae were not insulated. If your neighbor had an argument at 2 in the morning, and remember the streets were busy at 2 in the morning because that is when the carts came, you heard every word. Modern city dwellers certainly know urban noise, but today we have earplugs, we have white noise machines, we have building codes that require sound insulation between apartments, we have zoning laws that push industrial activity away from residential areas. We can close a window and significantly reduce what we hear from the street. Ancient Romans had none of these tools. The noise was simply a condition of life, and you either adapted to it or you went quietly mad. Let us move from where Romans slept to what they ate, because food tells us a great deal about the texture of daily life. And the first thing to understand is this: most Romans did not cook at home. This was not a lifestyle choice, it was a practical necessity. Most apartments in insulae had no kitchens. The fire risk was too high. Remember those thin walls, those wooden supports, those crowded upper floors? Cooking with an open flame in a small apartment was genuinely dangerous. So instead, Rome developed what we might today call a street food economy. The city was absolutely packed with thermopolia, essentially ancient fast food counters built into the fronts of buildings with large terracotta pots sunk into stone counters, keeping food warm throughout the day. Archaeologists have found hundreds of them in Pompeii alone, remarkably well preserved by the volcanic ash of 79 CE. You could buy lentil soup, olives, cheese, bread, sausages, wine, and various stews at these counters. The Roman diet, especially for the poor, was heavily based on grain. Bread was the cornerstone. Porridge made from spelt or emmer wheat, a dish called pulse, was a staple going back centuries. The Roman government actually distributed free grain to a significant portion of the city's population, a policy called the annona, which became one of the most important political tools in Roman history. At various points, hundreds of thousands of Roman citizens received free or subsidized grain. But eating well, eating varied, nutritious, enjoyable food was expensive. Meat was a luxury for most ordinary Romans. Fish was more accessible, particularly preserved fish products like garum, a fermented fish sauce that Romans put on essentially everything and which was roughly the ancient equivalent of a combination of soy sauce and Worcestershire sauce. Vegetables, legumes, olives, and olive oil filled out the diet.
Rome's aqueducts were justifiably famous. At their peak, 11 major aqueducts brought hundreds of millions of liters of fresh water into the city every day. By the standards of the ancient world, this was genuinely extraordinary. Rome's water supply per capita was arguably not matched again in Europe until the 19th century. Public fountains were everywhere. The water was mostly clean and freely available. But here is the catch. The water flowed freely at ground level and below, to public baths, public fountains, and the ground floor pipes of wealthier citizens. If you lived on the fourth floor of an insulae, the aqueduct did not help you directly. You still had to go down to the street, fill a heavy clay or lead vessel at the public fountain, and carry it back up, every single day, multiple times a day. Water for drinking, for cooking, for washing your face and hands, heavy, inconvenient, and time-consuming. And then there is the lead problem, which the Romans themselves partially understood and partially did not. Roman water pipes were often made of lead. The Latin word for lead, plumbum, is where we get the word plumbing. Some Roman writers noted that lead seemed to cause illness, but the understanding was incomplete. Modern researchers have found elevated lead levels in Roman skeletal remains, and the long-term effects of chronic low-level lead exposure, fatigue, cognitive impairment, mood disorders, reduced fertility, would have been pervasive and largely invisible to the people experiencing them. Compare all of this to the modern experience. Turn a tap, clean water comes out instantly at whatever temperature you want, at whatever floor you are on. It is so ordinary that we don't think about it. For Romans on upper floors, water was a daily physical burden. Now, let us step outside. Let us walk the streets of Rome and see what we encounter. And I'll tell you up front, it was not a pleasant experience. The streets of ancient Rome were narrow, extraordinarily narrow by modern standards. Even the main streets in the city center were often only 4 to 6 meters wide. Side streets and alleys were sometimes barely wide enough for 2 people to pass each other. And these streets were crowded with people, with animals, with vendors, with beggars, with slaves carrying goods for their owners, with soldiers, with philosophers giving impromptu lectures, with politicians being carried in litters by teams of enslaved bearers. The streets were also filthy. There were sewers, Rome's Cloaca Maxima, one of the world's earliest major sewage systems, was a genuine engineering achievement and drained the main forums and public buildings into the Tiber. But the vast majority of Rome's streets did not connect to it. Human and animal waste was everywhere. The streets smelled powerfully of it. Stepping in something unpleasant was not a risk, it was a near certainty. Wealthy Romans wore high-soled shoes or sandals, partly for aesthetic reasons, and partly just to stay slightly above the mess. The practice Juvenal described of people throwing chamber pots from upper-floor windows was apparently real and common enough to be written into Roman law. If something fell from an upper window and injured a passerby, the occupants of that floor were legally liable. The law existed because people needed to be discouraged from doing it, which means people were regularly doing it. There was also serious crime. Rome at night, once the legitimate foot traffic died down and the cart noise began, was considered genuinely dangerous. Juvenal, again, he describes the experience of walking home at night in Rome as a genuine exercise in fear. Muggers were common. Gangs controlled certain districts. The city had no organized police force until Augustus created the vigiles and later the Praetorian Guard. And even then, policing was uneven and largely focused on protecting the emperor and the upper classes. If you were robbed, beaten, or worse on a Roman street at night, your options were limited. You could go to the magistrates in the morning, but prosecution required you to bring the case yourself. Rome had no public prosecutors. If your attacker was a wealthy or connected person, your chances of justice were very slim. The law, like everything else in Rome, worked much better if you were rich. Life expectancy and infant mortality. Let's talk about health. And let me be honest with you up front. Health in ancient Rome was not good. Life expectancy at birth in the Roman Empire has been estimated by historians at somewhere between 25 and 35 years. That number sounds shocking until you understand what's driving it: catastrophically high infant and child mortality. A significant proportion of Roman children, perhaps a third or more, died before their 5th birthday. Childhood diseases that are now prevented by vaccines or treatable with simple antibiotics killed Roman children in enormous numbers. Measles, smallpox, typhoid, dysentery. These were not occasional threats, they were constant presences in Roman life. If you survived childhood, your life expectancy improved considerably. A Roman who made it to 25 might reasonably expect to live into their 50s or 60s. Some Romans lived into their 80s and beyond. But the shadow of early death fell over every Roman family. It was normal, heartbreakingly, numbingly normal, to lose children. Most Romans seemed to deal with this through a kind of stoic acceptance that modern people, accustomed to child mortality rates near zero in the developed world, can barely imagine. Medicine and its limits. Roman medicine was, by the standards of the ancient world, actually quite sophisticated in some areas. Roman physicians like Galen, who worked in the 2nd CE and whose influence extended into the Renaissance, made real contributions to anatomy, pharmacology, and surgical technique. Roman military medicine was particularly advanced. The legions had organized medical corps, field hospitals, and surgeons who were remarkably skilled at treating wounds.
But Roman medicine had no concept of germ theory. The idea that tiny, invisible organisms caused infectious disease was simply not available to them. Romans understood that disease seemed to spread from person to person, and they had various theories about why: bad air, divine punishment, bodily imbalances. Some of these intuitions led to genuinely useful public health practices: building cities away from swamps, maintaining clean water supplies, removing garbage, building public baths. But without understanding the actual mechanism of disease transmission, there was a ceiling on how effective any of this could be. Surgery was performed without anesthesia as we know it. Patients were given wine, opium-based preparations, or mandragora root, which had some sedative effects, but no reliable way to prevent pain. Being operated on in ancient Rome was an experience of extraordinary suffering that required not just skill from the surgeon, but courage bordering on heroism from the patient. Even relatively minor procedures carried serious risk of infection. The Roman baths, public health, and social life. One of Rome's genuine public health achievements was the system of public baths, the thermae. Large cities had many of them. Rome itself had hundreds of smaller neighborhood baths and several enormous imperial complexes, like the Baths of Caracalla, which could accommodate thousands of bathers simultaneously. Bathing was not just about cleanliness in Rome, it was a deeply social activity. Romans went to the baths to meet friends, to conduct business, to gossip, to exercise, to read. The baths often had libraries, gardens, and snack vendors attached to them.
Entry was cheap or free. These were genuine democratic spaces in a highly stratified society, though men and women bathed at different times or in different sections, and the wealthy still managed to claim the best spots. The baths undoubtedly helped with hygiene and probably reduced certain kinds of disease transmission, but they also concentrated large numbers of people in warm, wet environments, which is an excellent recipe for spreading skin infections, respiratory diseases, and intestinal parasites. Archaeologists studying Roman latrines and ancient sewage have found extensive evidence of intestinal worm infections, even among Romans who used the public sanitation facilities regularly. Today, we take safe, private bathing for granted. We have hot water on demand, soap that actually kills bacteria, clean towels, and private space. The Roman baths were impressive and socially vital, but they were not clean in any modern sense of the word. Beyond the physical hardships, there was another kind of exhaustion in Roman life, the social kind. Roman society was extraordinarily hierarchical, and navigating that hierarchy consumed enormous amounts of time and energy for almost everyone except those at the top. Patrons and clients, the morning ritual. At the heart of Roman social life was the system of patronage, the relationship between patrons, wealthy, powerful individuals, and their clients, people who depended on those patrons for support, protection, and opportunity. This was not an informal arrangement. It was a deeply structured social institution with its own rituals, obligations, and expectations, and it began every single day, very early in the morning. The salutatio was the daily morning greeting ritual in which clients visited their patrons at home, usually at dawn or just after. You would go to your patron's house, dressed appropriately, which required you to own presentable clothes, wait in line with all the other clients, be admitted eventually, greet your patron briefly, perhaps receive a small gift of money called a sportula, and then go about your day. Your patron would note if you came and note if you did not. Missing the salutatio without good reason was social damage you could not easily repair. If you were a moderately successful freed man, a formerly enslaved person who had been released, or a craftsman or a small merchant trying to get ahead in Roman society, you might have one or several patrons whose goodwill you needed to maintain. You might spend 2 or 3 hours every morning simply doing this social maintenance work before you could start your actual job. The poet Martial, writing in the late 1st century CE, complained bitterly about this ritual: the early rising, the waiting, the heat in summer, the cold in winter, the indignity of standing in line to receive a coin from a man who barely remembered your name. And beneath all of this was the institution of slavery, which is impossible to discuss Roman daily life without acknowledging. Rome was a slave society in the most fundamental sense. Perhaps 20 to 30% of the population of Italy during the peak of the empire were enslaved people. Slave people did the cooking, the cleaning, the farming, the mining, the construction, the teaching, the administration, the skilled crafts. Some enslaved people, educated Greeks, skilled doctors, trained accountants, held positions of significant responsibility and relative comfort. Many others lived in conditions of brutal exploitation. For free Romans, the existence of slavery created a particular psychological and moral exhaustion that we can, with some effort, begin to understand. If you were a free poor Roman in Rome, you were competing economically with enslaved labor that cost your employer nothing beyond food and housing. Wages for free workers were therefore perpetually suppressed. Why pay a free man well when an enslaved person can do the same work for nothing? This created a grinding economic pressure on Rome's free working class that was structural and essentially inescapable. And if you owned enslaved people, even just 1 or 2, as many middle-class Romans did, you lived with the constant awareness that these were human beings with no legal protection from your decisions and with potential reasons to wish you harm. Roman law required that if a slaveholder was murdered, all enslaved people in the household be executed, partly as deterrence. This tells us something about the ambient fear and tension that ran through Roman households.
The Roman workday was structured differently from ours, and in some ways more sensibly, and in other ways more chaotically. Romans divided their day by the sun, 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of night, with the hours varying in actual length depending on the season. The first hour of the day, prima ora, began at sunrise. Work typically started very early, often within the first or second hour of daylight. Business was conducted in the morning. The courts, the forums, the markets, all of these operated primarily in the morning hours. By midday, the heat of the Italian summer meant that activity slowed significantly. Many Romans took a rest period in the middle of the day, the ancestor of the Mediterranean siesta, before activity resumed somewhat in the afternoon. By late afternoon and evening, social life took over. The baths, dinner parties, entertainment. The Roman calendar had a significant number of public holidays, feriae, when courts were closed and work was officially suspended. By the late Republic and into the imperial period, there were roughly 150 or more official festival days in the Roman calendar, though this did not mean ordinary people all had those days free. Farmers, slaves, and manual workers did not necessarily get holidays even when the courts were closed. But for the urban population, the number of festival days was genuinely substantial. In entertainment, bread and circuses. The phrase panem et circenses comes from the satirist Juvenal, and it captures something real about Roman mass entertainment. The Roman government understood that a large, potentially restless urban population needed to be fed and entertained. The games, the ludi, included chariot racing at the Circus Maximus, gladiatorial combat and animal hunts at the amphitheaters, theatrical performances, and public festivals. Entry to many of these events was free or very cheap. The Circus Maximus, Rome's great chariot racing venue, could hold somewhere between 150,000 and 300,000 spectators. Historians debate the exact number. Chariot racing was Rome's most popular spectator sport, and the great racing factions, the blues, the greens, the reds, the whites, commanded passionate loyalty that would not look out of place compared to modern sports fandom. People bet on races. People worshipped their favorite charioteers. People rioted when their team lost in ways that feel utterly recognizable today. The gladiatorial games were more complex than popular culture suggests. Gladiators were not always sent to their deaths. Skilled gladiators were expensive to train and valuable as entertainment, and the crowd did not always demand execution of a defeated fighter. But gladiatorial combat was real violence. People did die, and the games also included mass executions of condemned criminals and elaborate animal hunts that consumed thousands of animals. It was entertainment built on suffering, and Romans of all classes attended and enjoyed it. And then there was politics. The Roman political system, particularly after the transition from republic to empire under Augustus in 27 BCE, created a particular kind of ambient anxiety for anyone living in or near the center of power. Emperors ranged from genuinely competent and relatively benevolent administrators, Augustus, Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius, to figures who were, by any standard, dangerously unstable, Caligula, Nero, Domitian, Commodus. The problem was that under the imperial system, the personality of the emperor affected everything. Under a paranoid emperor, the Senate, theoretically still the governing body of Rome, became a place of genuine terror. Senators were executed for imagined conspiracies, for being too popular, for being too wealthy, for offending the emperor in ways they did not even understand. Informers, dilatores, became a plague during the reigns of suspicious emperors, with people denouncing their neighbors, colleagues, and even family members in exchange for a share of the denounced person's confiscated property. Trust collapsed. Friendships became dangerous.
For ordinary people further down the social scale, the day-to-day impact of imperial politics was less direct but still real. Tax collectors could be brutal. Military conscription could separate families. The economic effects of war, of bad harvests, of imperial mismanagement rippled down through Roman society. And there was the ever-present possibility that the political situation would tip into open civil war, which it did repeatedly, most catastrophically in the year of the Four Emperors in 69 CE, when 4 different men claimed the title of emperor within a single year, and Roman legions fought each other across the empire. Living in a system where ultimate power rested with a single individual who could not reliably be held accountable and whose temperament you could not predict, created a kind of low-level existential uncertainty that colored Roman life for centuries.
So, ancient Rome, 1 million people. Crowded, noisy, dangerous, dirty, politically unstable, medically limited, socially hierarchical, sleep-deprived, exhausted. And yet, and this is the remarkable thing, Rome endured for centuries. People were born there, fell in love there, laughed at the theater there, argued passionately about chariot racing teams there, built friendships and businesses and families there, and found meaning and beauty there in ways that we can still feel through the poetry and the letters and the graffiti they left behind. Because here is what ancient Rome teaches us even in its exhaustion. Human beings are extraordinarily adaptable. What seems unbearable from the outside, from a distance of 2,000 years, was simply life to the Romans. They did not know about double-paned windows or tap water or antibiotics or fire suppression systems. They did not have a comparison point. They had what they had, and they made of it what they could. Some of it was brutal. Some of it was beautiful. Most of it was somewhere in between, just ordinary people getting through their days the same way people have always done. The next time you run a tap and clean water comes out instantly, the next time you flip a light switch at night and the room glows safe and bright, the next time you take an antibiotic and a fever breaks in 48 hours instead of killing you, the next time you sleep in a quiet, fire-resistant apartment without the sound of iron wheels on stone, remember that these things are extraordinary. They are the result of accumulated centuries of human effort and innovation. They were not always there, and for most of human history, they were not there at all. Ancient Rome was exhausting, and in its exhaustion, it is one of history's great reminders of just how far we have come. Thank you for watching. Sleep well. We will see you next time.